Kia ora, good morning everyone, Rich Wong here, welcome back to the channel. So recently I have published quite a few different Nikon Z mount reviews, and today we are going to have a look at another lens for the Nikon Z mount. This is the Nikon 24-120 f4S lens. The Nikon 24-120 f4 is a 5x zoom lens with constant f4 maximum aperture. One quite interesting thing is, on Nikon's lens roadmap, this lens was originally listed as a 24-105 lens, so slightly shorter at the telephoto end, but when they finally release it, it's now a 24-120 lens, which of course I think nobody is going to complain. It is a S-line lens, which means it is the best Z-mount lens from Nikon with excellent image quality and better features and build quality. Of course, we'll have a look at the image quality very soon and see if it does meet our expectation or not. The size of this lens, as you can see, it is quite compact for a full frame 5x zoom lens with f4 constant aperture. If you look at the numbers, it may appear to be slightly longer than the old f-mount DSLR version 24-120 lens, but because of the difference in flange distance, so if you use the f-mount version on a Z camera, you will need to use the FTZ adapter, then the f-mount version would end up being a bit bigger than this new Z version. The weight of this lens is 630 grams, so not bad at all, even a little bit lighter than the old f-mount DSLR version. One reason why this new version is a bit lighter, maybe because it does not have VR, so it just relies on the camera's IBIS to do the image stabilization instead. But on the other hand, this lens does have a lot of new technology and features that the old f-mount version doesn't have. For example, it has an extra customizable control ring here on the lens, and it uses two high-speed STM autofocus motor. I just mentioned the size of this lens is quite compact, but this lens does extend quite a bit when you start to zoom in. When you zoom into 120mm, the telephoto end, the lens extends about 60mm, so the total length of the lens is just under 180mm. On the flip side, it is an internal focus lens, so the length of the lens doesn't change when you change the focus distance. It is a weatherproof lens, so you don't have to worry too much if you want to take some photos or video under bad weather. I mentioned that there is a customizable control ring on the lens. There is also a customizable function button next to it. As the lens doesn't have VR, the only switch on the lens is a autofocus manual focus switch. Overall, the build quality of this lens is pretty decent. Even when I fully extend the lens still doesn't feel flimsy. And compared to the old 24-120 lens for the f-mount, this new version feels better and definitely feels a lot less plasticky. This Nikon 24-120 f4S lens uses two STM autofocus motor, and the autofocus speed is pretty fast. I was reviewing this lens with the Viltrox 50mm f1.8 Z lens at the same time using the Z9, and while the Viltrox autofocus speed isn't really slow, but when I switched to this 24-120 lens, I immediately noticed the autofocus speed of this lens is just a lot faster in comparison. It is also very quiet as well, so it wouldn't be an issue even when you don't want to have any autofocus noise. If you want to use this lens to take some close-up photos, one interesting thing is the minimum focus distance is 0.35 meter throughout the entire zoom range. What it means is you can get the highest magnification ratio when you are shooting at the telephoto end, and that is 0.39 times, which is really pretty good compared to most other lenses that I've reviewed recently that only give me around 0.1 or 0.15 times maximum magnification ratio. This Nikon lens allows me to get a lot closer to my subject. Okay, now let's have a look at the image sharpness, and let's start from the wide and 24mm focal length first. At the maximum aperture f4, the center of the image is already very sharp, very good contrast, and I also don't see any chromatic aberration. Stopping down the lens to f5.6 or f8, there really isn't much difference in terms of center sharpness. And now let's have a look at the corner. At f4, the corner is a little bit soft, still very usable though. Stopping down the lens to f5.6 and f8, the corner gets a bit sharper, but it doesn't get as sharp as the center of the photo. And now let's have a look at the sharpness at 50mm. The center is very sharp again at 50mm, and stopping down the lens doesn't make any difference to the center sharpness. Corner is decent at f4, but you get better corner sharpness once you stop down the lens to f5.6. The corner at 50mm is definitely better than at 24mm. And at the telephoto N 120mm, once again the center is very sharp at f4 already, so stopping down the lens doesn't really improve the center sharpness. And if we look at the corner is also pretty decent at f4, and once stopped down to f5.6, it is now very sharp. So in terms of corner sharpness, it appears the longer the focal length, the sharper it is for this Nikon Z24-120 lens. A f4 standard zoom lens is never going to be a bokeh monster, but when you are shooting at the telephoto end with this 24-120 lens, you could still dissolve the background reasonably easy. The bokeh balls from this lens looks pretty smooth, not too nervous at all. There could be a bit of bokeh clipping when you are shooting at the maximum aperture f4. However, stopping down slightly to f5.6 appears to be enough to get rid of all the bokeh clipping. Bokeh balls remain reasonably round even when I stop down to f11. At the wide angle and 24mm focal length, there is some noticeable but not really severe vignetting at the maximum aperture f4, and it becomes much better once you stop down to f5.6. At the telephoto N 120mm, vignetting is a bit stronger than at 24mm when shooting at the maximum aperture. But once you stop down the lens to f5.6, the light fall off is much less noticeable already. So overall, I think vignetting is reasonably well controlled with this lens, especially at the wide angle end. Chromatic aberration is very well controlled by this Nikon 24-120 f4S lens. Looking at all the high contrast photo I shot with this lens, I can see only really minimal amount of color fringing no matter what focal length I was shooting at. A 5x zoom lens that covers from 24mm to 120mm could be a big challenge in terms of distortion control, but surprisingly this Nikon lens does a really good job in this area. Looking at this footage that I changed the zoom from 24mm to 120mm, the distortion is really minimal, so I'm pretty impressed. Lens flare control is pretty good with this Nikon lens. Most of my photos I see either no lens flare at all or at a very low level. Even when shooting into the sun during the middle of the day, there is a bit of ghosting, but overall the amount of lens flare is still very well controlled. If you like to have some beautiful sun stars in your photo, then unfortunately this Nikon 24-120 f4S lens is not your best choice to capture some beautiful sun stars. You really need to stop down the lens a lot to make the sun stars obvious in the photo, like around f16. And even when you stop down to the minimum aperture, the sun stars still doesn't look very sharp or beautiful to me. With a constant f4 maximum aperture, it is not exactly a fast lens, so I was not expecting to see any significant chroma even when shooting at the maximum aperture, and when I did my usual chroma test, I really didn't notice any noticeable chroma at all even when shooting at the maximum aperture f4. If you are planning to do some filmmaking, you will be pretty happy with this lens. As I mentioned before, the autofocus is really quiet. When I test it with the Z9, it also tracks my subjects really smoothly and really quickly as well, even when I was shooting some bird in flight videos. The lens also seems to be a parfocal lens, or at least very close to it. This is a test video footage that I locked the focus in manual focus mode, and when I change the focal length between wide and telephoto end, the focus point appears to remain the same. Focus briefing is also quite minimal. This is a test that I changed the focus between 1.5 meter and 20 meter. The amount of focus briefing is quite a bit less than average. I'm sure a lot of photographers have been waiting for this 24-120 f4 lens for a while, and now it arrived and it doesn't disappoint at all. The overall image quality is really good and well deserved the S-Line badge it carries. I really love its close focus capability, very minimal amount of distortion. In fact, the only area that I feel is not that good is sun stars, which is quite average, but otherwise the lens is as good as I can hope for a 5x f4 zoom lens. For videographers, this is also an excellent lens with its great focus briefing control and parfocal-ish performance. The fact that the price of this lens is the same as the old f-mount version, but it packs a lot of new technology and improvements, means it is a lens that is really great value for money. If you are a Nikon shooter and want a lens that can do a bit of everything for you, this is surely the lens that I would highly recommend to you.